Sharon's true story. When her DIL said she wasn't family, she changed one document, and everything shifted. Sharon had spent 32 years building a life in a quiet neighborhood in Sacramento, California. She raised 2 sons, buried a husband, and believed that family was the one thing no one could take from her. But when her daughter-in-law looked her in the eye and said those 5 words, "You're not really our family," Sharon realized that love alone doesn't protect you, and that sometimes the quietest act of self-respect is the one that shakes an entire family to its core. There's a moment in every family story where someone says something that can never be unsaid. And for Sharon Mitchell, 64 years old, living alone in a 3-bedroom house in Sacramento, that moment arrived on a Sunday afternoon in October, over a plate of pot roast she had spent 4 hours preparing. But before we get to that Sunday, before we get to the words that split her world open, you need to understand who Sharon was and what she had already survived. She married David Mitchell when she was 22. He was a civil engineer, steady and deliberate, the kind of man who measured twice before he cut anything wood. Words, decisions. They didn't start with much. A small apartment near Midtown, second-hand furniture, a shared car they took turns driving to work. But they were builders, both of them. Brick by brick, year by year, they constructed a life that felt solid. They bought the house on Greenfield Lane when Sharon was 29. She still remembers the way David stood in the empty living room and said, "This is where our grandchildren will open Christmas presents." And he was right. For a while, he was right about everything. They had 2 boys. Kevin came first, loud, adventurous, always climbing something he shouldn't. Then Marcus, 4 years later, quieter, more watchful, the kind of child who noticed when his mother was tired before she said a word. Sharon poured herself into those boys. She volunteered at their schools, coached Kevin's little league team one summer when no other parent stepped up, sat through every single one of Marcus's piano recitals, even when the early ones were, honestly, painful to hear. David worked long hours, and Sharon held the center. That was their unspoken agreement. He built bridges and overpasses for the county. She built the family, and for decades it worked. Then David got sick. Pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed in March and gone by November. 8 months. Sharon was 56 years old, and the man who had been her partner for 34 years was simply no longer there. The house on Greenfield Lane, which had once been full of noise and mess and life, became very, very quiet. Grief is a strange architect. It rebuilds you whether you want it to or not. Sharon grieved deeply, privately, in the way women of her generation often do behind closed doors, with a cup of tea and old photo albums, never letting her sons see the worst of it. She told herself she had to stay strong for Kevin and Marcus. They had lost their father. They didn't need to lose their mother to sorrow, too. So she kept going. She kept the house. She maintained every holiday tradition David had loved: the 4th of July barbecue, the Thanksgiving turkey brined with his secret recipe, Christmas Eve with too many candles and not enough counter space. She became grandmother to Kevin's 2 children, Emma and Noah, and she gave those grandchildren everything she had left to give. She babysat 3 days a week. She cooked meals and froze them in labeled containers for Kevin's family. She helped with school pickups when schedules got tight, and when Kevin and his wife needed help with a down payment on their first house, Sharon wrote the check without hesitation. $43,000. She never asked for it back. She never even mentioned it again. Her identity after David's death was simple and complete. She was a mother and a grandmother. That was enough. That was everything. Kevin married Diane 7 years ago. Sharon remembered liking her immediately. She was sharp, organized, the kind of woman who always had a plan. In the beginning, Diane called Sharon on weeknights just to talk. She asked for recipes. She invited Sharon to the kids' school plays and soccer games. It felt natural. It felt like gaining a daughter. But somewhere along the way, and Sharon could never pinpoint exactly when things shifted, the phone calls got shorter. Invitations came later, sometimes not at all. Holiday dinners that Sharon used to help prepare became events she simply attended. She noticed, of course she noticed, but she told herself it was normal. Families grow, people get busy. She chose not to name it because naming it would make it real. Sharon believed, with every fiber of her being, that if you love hard enough and give generously enough, you will always belong. That love was a permanent address, not a lease that could expire. This belief had carried her through widowhood, through loneliness, through every quiet evening in that too big house. But belief and reality don't always live in the same house, and Sharon was about to learn that the door she thought was always open had been slowly closing for years. It was a Sunday in early October when everything cracked open. Sharon had spent the morning cooking David's pot roast recipe, the one with rosemary and slow caramelized onions that had filled their house with warmth every Sunday for 30 years. She set the table with her good china, the white plates with the thin gold rim reserved only for family. She bought yellow tulips from the farmer's market because Lily once said yellow was her favorite color. She hadn't seen the grandchildren in 3 weeks, and 3 weeks felt like a season when they were growing so fast. Lily was 5. James had just turned 3. Sharon ironed the tablecloth, put on lipstick. She was 67 years old, standing in her kitchen, excited like a woman expecting something wonderful. They arrived at 4. Lily ran to Sharon for a hug, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it should. But dinner told a different story. Diane spent most of the meal on her phone, scrolling with one hand, eating with the other. The children were restless, asking to be excused before dessert. Kevin barely spoke, pushing food around his plate like a man trying to disappear. Sharon told herself it was just a long week. After dinner, while serving the apple crumble she had made from scratch, she brought up Thanksgiving. She always hosted. It was the one tradition that survived David's passing. She said it casually. I was thinking we could start at 2 instead of 3 this year, so the kids aren't up too late. Diane set her phone down with a deliberate click. Actually, we're doing Thanksgiving with my family this year. Just immediate family. Sharon blinked. But I am immediate family. And then Diane said it without looking up, without hesitation, as if it were so obviously true it required no preparation. Sharon, let's be honest. You're Kevin's mother, but you're not really our family. Not in the way that matters for holidays and decisions. The silence that followed was unlike any Sharon had ever known. It wasn't empty, it was full. Full of every Sunday dinner she had cooked, every birthday gift wrapped, every check written, every time she had bitten her tongue to keep the peace. She looked at Kevin, her firstborn, the boy she had nursed through fevers and held when his father died. Kevin was staring at his plate. His jaw was tight, but his mouth stayed closed. He said nothing, Sharon describes this moment as the first time I realized I could be erased from my own family while still being alive. It felt like someone had taken a photograph of her life and quietly cut her out with scissors. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. Something born of dignity or perhaps shock kept her upright. She said simply, "I see," and began clearing the dishes. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of coats being gathered and children buckled into car seats and a kiss from Kevin that felt like an apology he couldn't say aloud. That night, Sharon sat in David's old armchair, the brown leather one that still smelled faintly of him, and felt something open inside her chest. Grief, heavy, genuine grief, the kind she recognized from after David's funeral. But this was different. David had been taken by fate. This was a choice. Someone had chosen to remove her. And mixed with that grief, something else rose slowly, a quiet, steady anger, not rage, not bitterness, something more deliberate. The days that followed were shapeless. Sharon replayed the moment endlessly. Diane's flat voice, Kevin's silence, the click of the phone on the table. She called Marcus, her younger son, in Portland. He listened, said the right things. "That's terrible, Mom, and you don't deserve that." But sympathy over the phone dissolves before it reaches the wound. She thought about calling Kevin a dozen times, picked up the phone, stared at his name, and put it back down. What would she say? "Please tell your wife I matter"? She felt ashamed, and the shame confused her, because she had done nothing wrong, unless loving too freely, and assuming you belonged was something wrong. For 2 weeks, Sharon lived in that limbo, too hurt to reach out, too proud to beg for a place at a table she had built with her own hands. She moved through her days like a woman underwater, everything muted and slow. And then one morning, sitting at her kitchen table, with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, she made a decision. She made a decision that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with truth. Sharon picked up the phone that morning and called Patricia Evanston, her estate attorney, a woman she'd known for 15 years, ever since David first got sick, and they'd needed to get their affairs in order. Patricia's office was in a small brick building on Maple Avenue, the kind of place with leather chairs and family photos on the credenza. Sharon had always felt safe there. She made an appointment for the following Tuesday. The will Sharon had in place was 12 years old, drafted shortly after David passed. In it, she had divided everything equally between her 2 sons. The house a 4-bedroom craftsman she and David had bought in 1987, now valued at roughly $780,000. Her savings, which she had built carefully over a decade of widowhood, $340,000. David's life insurance payout, which she had invested conservatively and grown with patience. All told, the estate was worth approximately $1.4 million. Kevin had been named as her power of attorney. Kevin had been named as her healthcare proxy. Kevin, the son who lived 20 minutes away. Kevin, whose wife had looked at her across a dinner table and said she was not family. On Tuesday, Sharon drove to Patricia's office. She parked her car, sat in the parking lot for a full 3 minutes, and then walked inside. She sat down in one of those leather chairs, and she told Patricia everything: the dinner, the words, the silence from Kevin afterward, the 2 weeks of shame and confusion. Patricia listened the way good attorneys listen, without interruption, without visible reaction, with the kind of steady presence that makes you feel heard without feeling pitied. When Sharon finished, she said 5 words that Patricia later told her she would never forget. She said, "If I'm not family, then I don't owe family obligations." There was no trembling in her voice, no tear, just clarity, the kind that arrives after a long season of fog. Together, they restructured everything. Marcus became the primary beneficiary, receiving 70% of the estate. A trust was established for Lily and James Sharon's grandchildren, Kevin's children dedicated specifically to their education. But the trust would be managed by Marcus, not Kevin. Kevin's share was reduced to a symbolic amount, enough to acknowledge that he existed, not enough to pretend that nothing had happened. And Kevin was removed as power of attorney, removed as healthcare proxy. Sharon named Marcus in his place and listed Patricia as the secondary. She signed each page with steady hands. Now I want to be clear about something, because it matters. Sharon did not do this out of revenge. She did not sit in that attorney's office with a heart full of spite, plotting punishment. That is not who Sharon is. She did it out of clarity. There is a difference between punishing someone and simply refusing to keep pretending. Sharon had spent years, decades, really making decisions about her family based on how she wished people would treat her. She gave based on hope. She planned based on the family she imagined she had, not the family that actually showed up. She told me once, months later, for the first time in my life, I made a decision based on how people actually treated me, not on how I wished they would treat me. That distinction between the fantasy family and the actual family became something she returned to again and again. The fantasy family is the one where everyone loves equally, where effort is reciprocated, where you belong simply because you gave everything you had. The actual family is the one that shows up, the one that calls, the one that does not let someone else's cruelty go unchallenged at their own dinner table. Sharon made one more change that day, smaller in dollar amount, but enormous in what it meant. David had kept a separate life insurance policy worth $200,000, with Kevin listed as the beneficiary. Sharon changed it. She redirected it to a local children's charity that David had supported for years, a literacy program at the public library, where he used to volunteer on Saturday mornings. She said, quietly, almost to herself, David would have wanted his money to go where love actually lives. Patricia notarized the documents. Sharon signed the final page, and then she drove home. She told no one, not Marcus, not Kevin, not her neighbor Barbara, who she told nearly everything. She simply filed the documents in the fireproof safe in her bedroom closet, the one David had bought in 1994, and she closed the lid. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat on her back porch and watched the sun move across her garden, and she said that for the first time in months she felt like she could breathe. Not happy, exactly, not victorious, just clear. Like a window someone had finally wiped clean. The documents were signed, sealed, and stored. Sharon went back to her quiet life, her morning walks, her library books, her garden beds that needed tending before autumn. But silence, in families, has a way of speaking louder than words. And it was not long before the consequences of that Sunday dinner began to ripple outward in ways that none of them could have predicted. 3 months passed. Sharon made no announcement. She simply withdrew quietly, gradually, like the tide pulling back from shore, so gently you don't notice the sand is dry until you look down. She answered Kevin's calls when they came, kept her voice warm, asked about the children and his work. but she stopped calling first. She stopped offering to take the grandchildren for weekends. She did not mention Thanksgiving. She did not ask about Christmas plans. She existed at a distance she had never occupied before, and she held that distance with a quietness that was absolute. Kevin noticed. He told himself it was nothing. Mom was busy. Mom had her routines. He mentioned it to Diane once over dinner. Mom hasn't offered to take the kids in a while. Diane shrugged. She's probably tired. She's 73, Kevin. And that was the end of it. Diane did not notice at all, or perhaps she simply didn't care to look closely enough to see. The discovery came in November, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like rain. Kevin was refinancing a rental property, a small duplex near the coast, that Sharon had helped him purchase 8 years earlier with $32,000 from the savings she and David had built together. The property was in Kevin's name, but Sharon remained listed on certain documents as a secondary party. The banker needed her co-signature. When the banker pulled the associated records, she paused. Mr. Aldridge, I'm showing that your mother recently updated her power of attorney designation. You're no longer listed. Kevin called Sharon that afternoon, his voice carefully steady. Mom, the bank said something about your power of attorney being changed. Sharon was sitting on her back porch. She could hear a scrub jay in the oak tree. Yes, I made some changes to my estate documents. You're no longer my power of attorney. Silence. Then, why? Because I was told I'm not really family, Sharon said. Her voice was not cold, not sharp, simply clear. I'm honoring that boundary. Kevin's reaction came in waves. First confusion, genuine, open-mouthed confusion. Then guilt, brief and hot, flickering like a match struck in a dark room. And then, as guilt so often does when it is not welcomed, it transformed into anger. Not at himself, not at Diane, at Sharon. He accused her of being manipulative, of punishing Diane for one comment, of weaponizing her estate to control the family. Sharon let him finish. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. When he was done, she said, Kevin, I'm not punishing anyone. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference. That calm, that absolute, unbending calm, became Sharon's quiet power throughout everything that followed. She refused to perform distress. She simply stated her truth and let it stand. Kevin told Diane that night. Her reaction was immediate and volcanic. She called Sharon the next morning, voice tight with fury, accusing her of trying to control the family with money, of being vindictive, of holding a grudge over something taken completely out of context. Sharon listened. Then she said, Diane, you told me I wasn't your family. I accepted that. You cannot tell me I'm not family and also expect the benefits of being my family. Those two things cannot coexist. The line went quiet. Diane hung up. Marcus learned about the changes a week later. Sharon told him herself, over coffee at her kitchen table, because she believed he deserved to hear it from her directly. He sat with it for a long moment, rubbed his face with both hands. Mom, are you sure about this? She said, I've never been more sure of anything since your father died. Marcus called Kevin that evening. The conversation was short and not gentle. You let your wife disrespect Mom in your own home and said nothing. What did you expect? Kevin fired back that Marcus didn't understand, that marriage required compromise. Compromise doesn't mean your mother stops being your mother, Marcus replied. They didn't speak again for 3 weeks. The grandchildren felt it. Of course they did. Children always feel the temperature change in a room, even when no one explains the weather. Sharon ached over this, genuinely and physically, but she held her ground. What followed wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was something quieter and in many ways harder, the long, uncomfortable process of a family trying to figure out if it could still be a family at all. The first 6 months were the hardest, not because of silence, but because of the wrong kind of noise. Kevin reached out multiple times. He called, texted, even showed up one Sunday morning with coffee and bagels like he used to in college. But every attempt carried the same undercurrent. Mom, just change it back. Let's go back to how things were. He never once said he was sorry for what happened. He never acknowledged that Diane's words had cut his mother open in front of everyone. His version of fixing things was asking Sharon to erase the consequence while leaving the wound untouched. And Sharon, this woman who had spent decades putting everyone else's comfort first, finally refused. She told him clearly, without anger, but without apology, "I will always love you. I will always be your mother. But I will no longer pretend that being treated poorly is the price of being in your life." Those words cost her sleep and appetite, and several nights in Harold's old chair, wondering if she had gone too far. But deep down, she knew she hadn't. During this period, Sharon did something she had never done before she sought help. She found a support group at her local community center for older adults, navigating family estrangement. She walked in expecting to feel ashamed. Instead, she found a room full of people whose stories mirrored hers. Mothers pushed to the margins by in-laws, fathers who hadn't seen grandchildren in years, women who had rewritten their wills not from spite but self-preservation. She was not alone, and that realization carried her through the worst days. Sharon began journaling, something Harold had always encouraged. She filled pages with memories, with anger she didn't know she carried, with love letters to her grandchildren she might never send. She reconnected with old friends she had drifted from because she was always available for Kevin's family, always babysitting, always bending her schedule to fit their needs. Those friends welcomed her back without judgment, reminding her she was more than someone's mother or grandmother. She was Sharon with her own life and her own worth. 8 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, something shifted. Kevin came to Sharon's house alone, no Diane, no agenda. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had eaten cereal as a boy, where Harold had helped him with algebra and he cried, not like an adult managing his emotions, but like the boy who once came to his mother when the world was too heavy. Between those tears, he admitted things Sharon had long suspected but never heard aloud. He had been afraid of Diane's reactions for years. He had learned early to choose the path of least resistance. Every time Diane made a cutting remark about Sharon, he swallowed it because confronting her meant days of coldness at home. He had been choosing peace in his marriage over loyalty to his mother, and he was deeply ashamed. Sharon reached across the table and held her son's hand. "I forgive you," she said, and meant it completely. But she added, "Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Trust has to be rebuilt, and that takes changed behavior, not just tears." Kevin nodded. He was beginning to understand. As for Diane, the relationship never fully healed, and Sharon made peace with that. Diane never apologized directly, but she stopped making comments about Sharon not being family. She stopped the small daily cruelties that had accumulated over years like water wearing down stone. Whether this was genuine growth or strategic silence, Sharon chose not to investigate. She accepted that Diane might never change, and that acceptance, paradoxically, set her free. She no longer needed Diane to be different in order to feel whole. What mattered most to Sharon were Lily and James. She insisted on maintaining her relationship with her grandchildren, and Kevin facilitated regular visits. Sharon was meticulous about one thing. She never spoke poorly of Diane, not once. She wanted those children to know their grandmother's love as something pure and uncomplicated, unburdened by adult conflicts they were too young to carry. Sharon's story doesn't end with a neat bow reel. Life rarely does. But it ends with something perhaps more valuable than resolution. It ends with wisdom. And wisdom, once truly earned, asks to be shared. So let me draw from Sharon's story the lessons that apply not just to her life, but perhaps to yours. Because the dynamics she navigated, the slow erosion of belonging, the silence that masquerades as peace, the confusion between love and submission, these are not rare. They happen in living rooms and at holiday tables everywhere. They happen quietly, which is precisely what makes them so dangerous. The first lesson is one Sharon wishes she had learned decades earlier. You cannot love someone into treating you well. She spent years operating under the belief that if she gave enough, sacrificed enough, showed up enough, she would eventually secure her place. That if her generosity was large enough, it would become undeniable. But love, no matter how vast, cannot single-handedly build respect. Respect must be offered freely, or it doesn't exist at all. If you find yourself in a situation where your love is being consumed, but never returned in equal measure, pay attention to that imbalance. It is not a phase. It is not something that will self-correct with time. It is information clear, honest information about where you actually stand. The second lesson concerns the document itself, the will that became the turning point. A legal document is not a weapon. It is a mirror. Sharon did not change her will to wound Kevin or to retaliate against Diane. She changed it because the original document reflected a version of her family that no longer existed in reality. It described a closeness that had been dismantled, a belonging that had been revoked. When she updated it, she was not being cruel. She was being truthful, and this matters for anyone listening who has been putting off similar decisions. Your will, your power of attorney, your beneficiary designations, these should reflect who actually shows up in your life. Not who you wish would show up, not who used to show up, not who might show up someday if things change. The people who are present, who honor you, who treat your existence as something that matters, those are the people your documents should name. The third lesson is perhaps the most uncomfortable, because it is addressed not to the Sharons of the world, but to the Kevins. When someone you love is being diminished in your presence and you say nothing, you are not being neutral. Silence in the face of disrespect is not diplomacy, it is participation. Kevin sat at that dinner table and heard his wife declare that his mother was not family, and he chose stillness. He may have told himself he was keeping the peace, avoiding escalation, being practical, but what Sharon heard in that silence was agreement. If you are the person in your family who stays quiet while someone is being hurt, know this: your silence is louder than you think. The person being hurt hears it clearly. Even if you have convinced yourself it makes no sound. The fourth lesson is about the nature of boundaries themselves. After Sharon made her decisions, she was called manipulative. controlling, vengeful. These words are almost always deployed against people who finally stop tolerating mistreatment. But setting a boundary after someone has told you that you do not belong is not punishment. It is alignment. You are simply matching your actions to the reality that has been declared. If someone says you are not family and you respond by reorganizing your life accordingly, you are not being vindictive. You are believing them. And you are allowed to believe people when they tell you where you stand. Now, as for Sharon herself, she is 65 now. When she describes how she feels these days, she uses a word that surprised me. She says she feels lighter, not happier, exactly. She is honest about that. She still grieves. There are moments when she misses the easy closeness she once had with Kevin. The version of him that existed before silence became his default language. She misses the future. She imagined Sunday dinners with grandchildren, running through hallways, a family that expanded with love rather than contracting with conditions. That grief does not disappear. But the weight of pretending, of performing, of shrinking herself to fit a space that kept getting smaller, that weight is gone. Sharon told me something I have not been able to forget, she said. I spent 62 years of my life trying to earn a place in my own family. Now I know you shouldn't have to earn what should be freely given, and when it's not freely given, you have every right to stop paying the price. These days, Sharon spends her mornings in the garden David loved. She plants roses there, the climbing variety he always favored, and she tends them with the same patience she once reserved for people who did not tend her back. She is at peace, not because everything resolved perfectly, but because she finally understands what family truly means. It is not a title granted by law or conferred by marriage. It is not a word on a document or a seat at a table. Family is a choice made daily, a practice of love, respect, and presence. And for those of you navigating your own version of Sharon's story, perhaps her wisdom offers a gentle framework. Protect your dignity without burning every bridge. Honor your worth without demanding vengeance, and believe fully, without apology, that you deserve to belong somewhere you are welcomed freely.